Welcome to the seminar series in the governance of technology. I actually don't know if that's the official name of it, but it's close enough. My name is Martin Weiss. I'm Associate Director of the Center for Governance and Markets, and I'm also a professor in the School of Computing and Information at the University of Pittsburgh. It's my pleasure to introduce Eric Alston, who is kindly agreed to host this seminar series. Eric is a scholar in residence in the finance division and the faculty director of the Hernando de Soto Capital Markets program in the Leeds School of Business at the University of Colorado in Boulder. His research and teaching is centered in the fields of law and economics and institutional and organizational analysis, which he applies to research questions in the development of rights along frontiers, the design and implementation of constitutions, and questions of legal and institutional transitions more generally. Eric?
Yeah, thanks, Martin. As usual, really excited to be here. It kind of a dream when someone says, hey, will you organize a seminar series where you get to pick a lot of the brightest minds in the digital governance space and invite them to talk, and then get to ask them questions with the moderator's privilege? Like, 2 thumbs up. And so our current speaker is no exception to the roster we've had this semester. Wright is an expert in corporate and intellectual property law. He's a professor of law at the Cardozo Law School at Yeshiva University. He has extensive experience in internet and new tech issues. He's successfully started tech companies, sold them to Wikipedia, as well as serving as general counsel and vice president of product and business development at Wikia, the company he eventually successfully sold, and helped build an open source search engine. He's also clerked for the Honorable William J. Martini of the U.S. District Court for the District of New Jersey, and worked as an associate at several prominent New York law firms. So Aaron is quite familiar from a legal perspective about the realm of tech startups in general, but also blockchain technology in particular, because one area where his bio, as I understand it, isn't quite correct is he no longer has a forthcoming book about blockchain technology. That book's out. I've cited it. I like it. I assign it to my students. And so as a gentle nudge to perhaps update your faculty profile so more people will read that excellent book, I would encourage you there. But without any further ado, we're going to hear from Aaron about the challenges of regulating blockchain-based technologies. So with that procedural note, 35-minute talk followed by 20 minutes of Q&A. And then we have 30 minutes of flex time built in that we have traditionally tended to consume with discussion. So it really up to you how you want to use that period of time as well, but 35 minutes and I'll shut up now.
All right, thanks so much, Martin and Eric, for the warm introductions. Hey, everybody, I'm so glad you can make it. As Eric noted, I'm a professor at Cardozo Law School, have been deeply involved with blockchain technology since about 2011. Some other things just to note, I played a small role helping to launch Ethereum, which is the 2nd largest blockchain. I may have been, or at least we're part of the first cohort of lawyers that actually played around with this notion of a smart contract. So today, I'm gonna go through, let me just share my screen fully. Hopefully you guys can see this. Just, some of the emerging challenges of blockchain technology. And because blockchains are so financial in nature and fundamentally deal with the exchange of value, these legal questions kind of pervade the adoption of the technology from a business perspective. They pervade some of the ways that larger enterprises may decide to use the technology. And also they pervade the shape of the innovation that we're seeing on the ground from younger technologists and or technology companies. And so just to kind of set the table, I'm sure you have some familiarity, but I do like to do a bit of table setting. This talk's going to be mostly focused about public blockchains. So there's different types of blockchains, and happy to dive in on private blockchains. But what I'm most concerned about, and when I present the regulatory challenges, it mostly deals with public blockchains. Public blockchains have unique characteristics, and there's a bunch of them, but the most notable characteristics are that they're resilient and tamper resistant. So the data is stored on a blockchain in a way that makes it hard to modify or change, and they're hyper resilient in the sense that there's just data propagated across a peer-to-peer network, which means that it's always available. And so when technologists saw this, they got very, very excited because those are big problems to a number of computer scientists or folks that are building, automated or software-based systems. The second thing that I think makes public blockchains so interesting, and also in part why we're seeing so many regulatory challenges, is that more advanced blockchains like Ethereum have the ability to execute potentially autonomous software or code. So those are referred to, by technologists as smart contracts. Lawyers always bristle kind of at that notion, but this ability to actually have software running on a peer-to-peer network that could be triggered at any point in time, and once triggered can operate autonomously, is incredibly novel and new and incredibly powerful. The other thing that I think people often overlook about blockchains, which makes them particularly interesting, is that they can maintain a common state for computers. And thus, we've seen in previous software revolutions, earlier forms of peer-to-peer technologies, and they've kind of petered out. So think about Napster, some of the subsequent peer-to-peer networks that grew in the wake of Napster. They were all great, highly disruptive, completely changed industries, and I'll touch on that in a bit. But they kind of lack some core pieces so that more and more technologies could be built in this peer-to-peer manner. But because blockchains can maintain a common state, we now have the opportunity to explore this entire plane of peer-to-peer technologies in more detail, and have peer-to-peer technologies that are either superior to what we see today, or at least on par with what we've seen in more centrally maintained technology stacks. And these are the core characteristics that enable digital assets, right? The ability to use blockchain as a common state to keep track of things, the ability to know that it's always going to be effectively online and available for everybody, and the ability to transfer things in a very autonomous way enables things like the creation of digital assets, right? And not just digital assets, but novel digital assets that are not necessarily controlled by any one party. And we've seen a whole host of them. But beyond that, and particularly with next generation blockchains like Ethereum, these smart contracts in particular really increase the power of what we can do with assets. So assets that are digitized can now be zipped across the globe via smart contracts like any other form of information. And that's profound, right? We saw, the internet and innovations with telecommunication tech, which we were talking about right before the call as well, took information that used to be stored in some form of physical media, we digitized it, and we were able to settle the transmission of that information nearly instantaneously. And because of that simple innovation, we've seen entire industries changed. We've seen new business models emerge. We've seen tremendous reordering of society that I think we're still grappling with today. And why I think fundamentally blockchains are so interesting is that we've effectively done the same thing for assets. We can now convert assets that are either physically maintained or centrally maintained, have them managed via blockchain and zipped across the globe in a manner that's equivalent or similar to what we saw with email or other forms of information. And that is in part why this technology is so interesting. But thinking about also smart contracts in a different way, the other thing that's interesting about these autonomous systems is that we're able to begin to define something around digital assets that are akin to property rights. So property rights are, of course, legally recognized. A jurisdiction or a country or a specific region needs to define those property rights. But now with smart contracts, we can begin to define the metes and boundaries of digital assets, not using these traditional laws, but through code and software. And critically, we're able to not just create assets in the digital world, but actually scarce assets in the digital world. And that scarcity is something that has been missing in the digital revolution. It's created a tremendous number of commons problems that we grapple with today. So the notion that we can't own something digitally, we have to rent it or lease it or subscribe to it on platforms like Spotify, like Netflix, et cetera, is in part because of a technical limitation in the sense that we can't actually create scarcity. We can't prove that this is the only unit that something is related to. And now we have the ability to do that. And we have the ability to do that not just for native cryptocurrencies or virtual currencies like Bitcoin or Ether. We also have the ability to do that for really any other asset, concept, bundle of rights that we can think of. And we are increasingly seeing that emerge. We can also, and are also seeing smart contracts be bundled together to create not just assets themselves, but entirely automated systems. Now, today they're often financial, but I think over time we'll see more and more automated systems that are created using smart contracts. So increasingly, technologists will use smart contracts not just as some form of intelligent legal agreement. Instead, you can think of them really with what they do best, which is automate things, automate and enforce different rules and restrictions and parameters. And because these smart contract systems are getting more complicated, they're working together in more detailed ways, and they often tend to be designed in a way that's illegal, i.e. that they're functionally operational, but neutral to a given jurisdiction due to either technical reasons or in some instances political reasons, we start to see some challenges emerge. But thinking about this a little bit more holistically, we're seeing that digital assets and associated smart contracts are really beginning to create a new commercial stack. And this commercial stack mostly deals with digital assets, but we're seeing these different core components being developed. And I think in hindsight, when we kind of zoom out 10, 20 years, we'll consider everything on these bottom two layers as blockchain technology. Much like how when we think about the internet and we actually peer down to the technical level, we see that it's not one protocol, it's actually a whole bunch of different protocols that work together. And this is a bit incomplete. There may be other protocols that are also appended on here too. But this bottom layer where you're seeing a blockchain being used as effectively like a basic data storage, digital asset creation, rules engine, and settlement layer is being layered on top by other smart contract-based systems that are dealing with questions like exchange, so how two parties can trade a digital asset, custody, how you can keep those assets safe and secure, recording contracts, which is this notion that we can attach additional real-world rights on top of these assets, identity and attestation, where a party is able to prove that they are who they are and therefore the intended recipient of an asset, or that they are who they are so that you can send assets to them. And then last but not least, oracles, which can provide increased dynamic information into these smart contract-based systems, either from about other digital assets or about the real world, or even in some instances, let's say like human judgment. And this kind of core stack, when combined, is incredibly powerful. And we're starting to see the early glimmers of this solidify and support an entire whole ecosystem on top of it. So everything from NFTs and digital art to lending platforms to decentralized autonomous organizations and other new ways to build groups and manage groups, asset management layers, and also derivatives and synthetic assets. And there's a whole host more, but these are the types of services that can rely on this stack and are increasingly relying on the stack and continuing to grow. But because blockchains store highly resilient data and they create automatic actions, they often run afoul of laws that may attempt to limit the flow of information in certain jurisdictions. So that includes things like privacy laws, copyright laws, and obscenity laws. So to the extent that we have controls on how information is going to move, blockchains run directly counter to that. They're highly resilient, they're tamper resistant. That means you can't take information down once it's stored there. You can't limit it, where it's found, because it can be accessed on a peer-to-peer network anywhere around the globe. It creates certain challenges when we think about laws that relate to the flow of information. At the same time, because many of these blockchains themselves or these smart contract-based protocols that rely on a blockchain are architected to be decentralized and potentially pseudonymous, it also creates regulatory challenges because they appear to have no center. You don't have some organization, some company, some LLC, some legal entity that's sitting in the center. Instead, you fundamentally have this automated system which people are interacting with. And that creates a host of regulatory challenges, which I'll talk about in more detail. And fundamentally, what's making blockchains particularly difficult to regulate is that at their core, they're using code-based rules to operate. They're relying on what we argued in our book, Blockchain and the Law of the Rule of Code, new forms of rules, laws and regulations, and rules, laws and regulations that are not encoded in a more bureaucratic sense, but instead they're actually relying on software to define these rules and laws. So we've termed that Lex Cryptographica. But what it means is that the folks that are interacting with these systems, the people that are building these systems, they're hoping to order their affairs. They're hoping to decide how everybody's going to interact with one another, privately order themselves, not based on bureaucratic rules or written rules from the state or written rules and contracts. Instead, they're trying to rely on the rule of code to organize themselves. So they're looking to these code-based systems and rules to define how they should interact with one another, and they're placing trust in this code and ensuring that the code operates the way it's intended to, which is a pretty reasonable supposition on technology stacks like blockchain in order to order their affairs. But critically, these rules are a little bit different than the ones that we have today, right? Bureaucratic rules are fairly flexible. Legislature or state or a municipality, they can change rules. Now, they may not do that all the time, but there's lots of flexibility when it comes to adopting bureaucratic rules. For blockchains and their algorithmic rules that are embedded in a smart contract or in the blockchain themselves, once they're created, they're really hard to modify once set. And although we're beginning to see some potential pathways to softening some of that rigidity through things like governance tokens or governance rights, once a smart contract-based system is deployed onto a blockchain, it's there. There's no single central party that can take down that system. If people want to use it, it's available to be used. And there's no turning back at some point once it's been deployed. And that's why some have argued that blockchains and other forms of strong encryption will lead to crypto anarchy. So this notion that you can actually rely on strong encryption and blockchain-like systems, and although they were phrased in the earlier writings not as blockchains, but as tamper-resistant boxes, and that will make it increasingly difficult for centralized states to begin to impose laws, rules, and other forms of regulation. And a good example, if you're not familiar with this work, is Timothy May, who's one of the pioneers of the cypherpunk movement. And there's other thinkers and writers, mostly from the late 1980s, early 1990s, that began to kind of pull on this thread of logic. But in my view, despite these characteristics, despite the fact that we're dealing with hard to modify autonomous systems, it doesn't mean that the law gets completely thrown out the window. These systems at some point will be regulated and will likely increasingly be regulated, but the regulatory approach may look a little different than what we see today. And the reason I think this is in part because of history. If we look at the first wave of the internet, we saw a spate of decentralized technologies that were supposed to disrupt traditional media. And some folks may remember this, I definitely do, because it was mind-blowing. But we saw peer-to-peer networks, things like Napster, things like Nutella, LimeWire, a whole host of them, and they were supposed to completely eliminate traditional media. You were going to be able to create celestial jukeboxes and real-time streaming of any media, and it wasn't going to be controlled by any one central party. Copyright protections were universally declared dead, and a new era was kind of upon us. But as we saw the internet mature, we saw that existing copyright holders, people that had legal rights, challenged these networks and successfully shut them down, right? Whether that was Napster or many in its progeny. And at the same time, even if they couldn't shut down the technology, a good example here would be BitTorrent, they limited their growth, right? They looked for points of centralization around the BitTorrent network, brought strategic lawsuits in order to limit their ability for these peer-to-peer networks to grow. And in its wake, we see that the media industry hasn't at all been eliminated. Copyright law is still as good as it has been for the past 400 years. Instead, we've seen businesses adapt and new intermediaries, centralized intermediaries like Spotify, Netflix, Hulu, YouTube, et cetera, which were created and in many ways have the same characteristics as these earlier peer-to-peer networks, but they've complied with existing laws. And on top of that, I think today we're seeing that not only have they complied with existing laws, but they've actually surpassed some of the earlier technology that we saw with these early peer-to-peer networks. The same thing could happen with blockchains, and my sense is it will, but I don't think it's going to be as easy this time around. And that's in part because many of these earlier peer-to-peer networks did not actually have a blockchain to coordinate things. So if we went back in time and imagined something like Napster, but there was no central Napster Inc. that was running it, it would have been much, much harder for those copyright holders to begin to mount those challenges. But it's always important to note, right? And the reason I think that we'll likely see a similar path, although the approach will be different, is because all of this technology does not exist in a regulatory vacuum. Just because you create a new technology doesn't mean that governments go away, that people won't get hurt, that reasonable risks won't want to be accommodated and accounted for. So as a general principle, in my mind at least, to the extent a blockchain or smart contract-based application implicates a relevant law, these laws are going to apply. The question is, where are these laws going to be enforced? Which party is going to be responsible for a risk that's here? These laws can be enforced in a whole bunch of different ways. And that could potentially tame the adoption of blockchain technology, or it can actually encourage it, right? So by providing legal certainty, legacy businesses that operate in a non-blockchain context won't be able to as quickly adopt the technology, use the technology, incorporate it into their businesses because they have to manage risks. They have shareholders or other parties that they're responsible for. But again, I do think, unlike these earlier peer-to-peer regulatory issues, the regulatory challenges here are likely going to be harder. And that's because, and this is the point I drew on before, blockchains and smart contracts increasingly have no discernible center. And because many of today's regulations at their core look to some form of a central actor to apply applicable rules, regulators are going to have to take a different approach. So what type of approach may they take? Well, we saw that, frankly, during the first wave of blockchain tech, which I'd call from 2009 to 2017, early 2018, laws were readily applied, right? We saw Bitcoin emerge as an interesting new digital asset, and we saw laws quickly wrap around exchanges, centralized exchanges that were holding people's assets. So even though they call themselves exchanges or wallets, they changed the vernacular. Regulators are clever folks, often very nice. They recognized that they were custodying people's assets, and they looked a lot like a bank, and they applied existing banking regulations to folks like Coinbase and Kraken and a whole bunch of other ones. And if they couldn't comply with them, they would bring enforcement actions and either try to shut them down or fine them or try to get them in order. Same thing with token sales, right? So token sales or ICOs, we saw a whole bunch of people that were trying to raise capital for themselves. It was quite easy for the government to go after those centralized entities that were engaged in a token sale that ran into issues with security laws or groups. It didn't matter that they were scattered across the globe. It was pretty easy to do that. But newer waves of blockchain-based applications, in particular in areas like decentralized finance, are less centralized. They're relying not just on simple smart contracts to create assets, but these automated systems, and they're increasingly gaining market traction. So we've seen decentralized exchanges over the past year plus starting to replace centralized exchanges. There's just as much volume on decentralized exchanges like Uniswap, which you may be familiar with, as Coinbase. So in a year and a half, we've seen a preference from the users of the technology to not use centralized exchanges. Instead, they're looking to decentralized exchanges to engage in a core part of what blockchain technology does, which is enable the transfer of assets. We've also seen, as an example, non-custodial privacy-preserving solutions replacing custodial mixers. So regulators are very concerned, and I would argue probably most concerned about AML know your customer requirements. They don't want this technology to be used as a huge loophole for countries like Iran or North Korea to get around economic sanctions. And so anything that really runs into privacy preserving solutions is always going to be a red flag for regulators. But thus far, it hasn't been that big of a deal. If you were trying to anonymize yourself to buy drugs on a dark market on Tor, there was going to be some mixer that was involved at some point that facilitated a lot of that activity. They could identify who was running the mixer and shut them down. And they just did that before. But now we're seeing new, more advanced smart contract-based systems, which are using more advanced cryptography that has been theorized since the 80s and 90s or 2000s in universities, now getting operationalized on blockchain tech, that are non-custodial, right? Nobody's in the middle. It's just an automated system that can make sure that financial information is kept fairly private. We're also seeing, even with regard to token sales and deploying tokens that may be necessary for a project to operate, not coming from centralized parties, but instead being fair lodged, right? Being distributed to users of the platform, with the folks that develop the software not even taking a cut of it in order for it to be launched. So we're just seeing an increasing push towards things being much more widespreadly handled, right? Not through some central company, but really squarely relying on these automated smart contract-based systems. And what's particularly challenging from a regulatory perspective is that many of these non-custodial solutions are not really even peer-to-peer. Instead, they're pool-to-peer. So individuals are pooling their assets together to enable a financial service and providing those pooled assets to a party, a peer that needs it. And developers of the software themselves are not even running the software interface, right, the DApp, that users are using to interact with these smart contracts. So there's not a party running the website. There's not one party that's providing the capital that may be needed to provide a financial service. Instead, it's a group of disparate people. There's kind of decentralization that's being baked in all the way down. And that makes it particularly challenging if you're a regulator and you see something bad to happen to decide who should be held responsible. So regulatory approaches likely are going to need to be modified. And this is particularly true here in the US, because in the US, software development enjoys broad First Amendment protections. And I think that that's great. This is wearing my normative position on my sleeve, but having broad First Amendment protections for across the board, including for software, I think is a cornerstone of how we operate here. And it's probably something that regulators would be very uncomfortable on touching or unraveling. They're probably not going to touch it. So with limited exception, and those exceptions are if you're developing something that's completely unlawful in nature, software development itself or the parties that are developing these software probably are not going to be found to be on the hook unless they're developing something that's really bad that everybody knows it's going to hurt somebody, it's patently illegal. If there's fraud or some other type of issue that relates to the software development, they may face liability. But if they're really just developing software, not even deploying it, they're gonna presumably have pretty strong First Amendment defenses. So what's a regulator to do? One approach is to identify new intermediaries that sit on top of non-custodial solutions. So you can almost see, and I think we saw this with the internet itself. We saw that copyright's not going to attach if we're transferring information back and forth with one another, if you're putting up a website or a link or something along those lines. But we've increasingly seen that aggregators of all that information be a focal point for regulation. So the number one aggregator here would be something like Google, right? It aggregates all those links, well, at least in its original form, that were available on the World Wide Web. And it became a central party that kind of stewarded that whole ecosystem. We're seeing the same thing for digital assets. As it's become easier and easier to create digital assets, and as it's become easier and easier to trade digital assets on platforms like Uniswap and other DEXs, we're seeing new aggregation layers that are being built on top. They almost, and this is the argument, could form like the Google for the blockchain ecosystem. So you have a whole bunch of tokens, some of which are useful and maybe attached to important projects, et cetera. Then you have a whole bunch of garbage. So you need somebody to kind of filter that and curate that in different ways. So maybe regulations attached there, but it's still a little bit murky to see how things will develop. But even if you're able to, apply more regulations on these intermediaries, it's not going to prohibit the activity, right? The smart contracts, as I noted before, they're still there. So if people want to use them, they can use them. So you may be able to deter its growth and or widespread adoption, but you can't completely eliminate it. So the best regulatory approach basically becomes, how do we contain something that is a much, much more powerful version of BitTorrent? We can't get rid of it, but we have to kind of cabin it in different ways. And maybe that's an effective strategy, but not one that I would say regulators tend to be comfortable with. A second approach is to explore what lawyers would call secondary liability theories. So to target either users of smart contract protocols or those that are actually providing capital to these systems. So you can imagine a world where instead of targeting the software developers for something bad that happens, they go after the users, right? They say, you're the user of the platform, something bad happened, you're responsible for it. Completely reasonable, very pragmatic. Or you could say, look, you provided capital to this and you made some money from it and something bad happened, you should be responsible for that. Or to the extent that some of these networks have token holders or people that are exerting governance rights over a protocol, maybe those that have a high or large controlling interest may be found responsible. The thought being you could effectuate some sort of change, you chose not to, therefore you should be responsible. But there's even limitations here, right? As we learned with earlier peer-to-peer networks, enforcement at the user level is incredibly difficult. And if you go back to the history of Napster, the RIAA, which was effectively enforcing copyrights on behalf of its members, large music companies, labels, composers, et cetera, they went after the users first. They thought that that was the best strategy. And what they learned was, number one, wildly unpopular with the public. And number two, it was really expensive, right? Filing lots of lawsuits is a really hard thing to do. It's kind of like playing a game of whack-a-mole. So if governments have to go after end users, it may have some deterrent effect, but it's unlikely to really stem things more broadly. Targeting controlling members, if they hold a token, could arguably lead to less efficient governance of these protocols. Maybe we actually do want a disparate group of people that are interested in some of these projects to work together to make it better. So if you're attaching liability on those controlling members, what you're going to get is just autonomous systems instead of responsible systems. A good example in my mind, at least, and I have spent a lot of time in the Wikipedia ecosystem, Wikipedia is very community run and governed. And it's actually a very efficient system in terms of surfacing information, and it's actually a very well managed system. So even though other forms of content producers or aggregators have run into a number of issues with things like fake news, et cetera, Wikipedia has largely been immune from it. And in part, it's been immune from it because it actually has good governance at its core. So if we want healthy ecosystems, you probably want folks that are participating in the governance not to be dissuaded from doing that. There's also other approaches that governments could handle, but they're more draconian, or they have different sets of trade-offs here. So one way that we could think about regulating this technology is much more command and control. This is what folks have applied in areas like airlines or air travel, or the development of aerospace technology. It has to get approved, right? You have to get government approval to make changes to how an airplane works, how parts work. It has to meet safety standards. The government's the one that's kind of dictating the innovation policy there. And I think we've seen that there's a lot of downsides to that. So even though we have safe planes today, and much safer than they probably were way back in the day, we have an industry that has effectively zero innovation, which is problematic, at least until recently. So that could be one approach here. I don't know if the regulators actually have the competency to begin to do that, although obviously we can marshal resources and develop that competency internally. There's also attempts by governments to shape social norms. So the one interesting thing about blockchain technology is that it's pretty much like the internet launching on the internet, right? It's like a new internet-like technology that's launching with the internet on the back end. So it's very early, and I think a lot of the excitement around blockchain tech is probably a little bit outpacing kind of the current development. So governments at this point in time actually have a unique position to shape social norms. So we've seen things like HoweyCoin in the US from the Securities Exchange Commission, when there's token sales, basically trying to interact with people that were using it, making sure that people knew that this was not going to be a completely lawless part of the world, that regulators are watching. You can't, you have to be mindful of what you're doing. And I do think that helped in part kind of shape at least some of the later projects that came out once they knew that the government was in part focused on this. And the last area, and this is one that I'm pretty interested in, is just more market-based regulation. So to the extent that you want to begin to shape how these networks, including smart contract-based networks, operate, you can imagine the government actually increasingly participating in the market to shape it. So you may have noticed, and even though the blockchain industry complains about it, digital assets are taxed in a pretty draconian way. Every time you make a transfer of digital assets, you could potentially face a taxable event. If the government wanted to really encourage the use of digital assets, if you change that tax law, all the equations differ, right? It becomes a lot easier to understand it. It becomes a lot easier for businesses to accept and use this technology. So very basic things like tax law or market-based regulation can have a huge impact. You could charge different fees to different folks, and you can even imagine a government increasingly participating in these markets, either as part of a central bank or otherwise, to encourage or discourage participation. So if a government decided that it wanted to acquire a tremendous amount of Bitcoin, it would have a huge impact on the supply, price, et cetera, of that Bitcoin. So I think it's an approach, it's a novel approach, because I don't think on the internet you have this kind of market-based regulatory approaches. The final area, and this is something we spent quite a bit of time thinking about in our book, is actually using software itself as a regulatory lever. So instead of implementing laws in a bureaucratic manner, there's nothing limiting the government's ability to actually write software itself. So to use some of the properties of blockchain technology to define rules, to put in checkpoints, to define parameters, and then you can require that these systems actually interact with a blockchain-based set of laws, right? Actual laws passed by, democratic institutions, et cetera. So one idea here, and particularly because this is a big concern, are AML know your customer requirements. So imagine if instead of putting a list, an OFAC list on a website, which lists various different parties' names, if there was a list of addresses that were concerning from a government's perspective. If I could plug that into a decentralized exchange or some other form of software-based system and know that I'm not going to be liable for AML know your customer related issues, if I was a developer, I sure as heck would use that, right? I would take that certainty to accommodate what many folks would consider to be reasonable requirements. Or if I'm developing a dApp and I'm concerned about things like child pornography surfacing through a blockchain, because things like that can be stored on a blockchain, well, maybe if I knew the blocks that had that and I could filter that out and know that I wouldn't be responsible for transmitting awful material that everybody universally, with limited exception, thinks shouldn't exist. Well, that's a really great way to do it too. Or if I'm worried about tax issues, and I've done this as part of my research where I showed how you can model out the US tax code using a smart contract, you can have automated tax compliance. So if you're worried about tax collection, you can have a software-based system that can enforce it. And people can actually prove that they're complying with the law. So I think there's lots of different areas. I think what we're seeing in the blockchain ecosystem are lots of tricky legal questions about where the law shall attach. At some point, we'll figure out where it does attach. So I don't think blockchains will be completely lawless, but the approach is going to look a little bit different. And I do think some of the lessons that we learned with copyright, infringement, and earlier peer-to-peer networks are going to bleed through to here too. So with that, I will stop, and I look forward to any questions that you may have.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Aaron. So as usual, if you're in the audience, and because we've had some audience members tune in from libraries and can't directly ask your question, feel free to drop it in the chat box and I'll ask it to Aaron for the benefit of the recording audience. But also, in the meantime, I have an initial question for you, Aaron, which was,
Sure.
You mentioned at one point that increasingly tokens may well serve to represent real world bundles of rights. As a property scholar, I'm quite familiar with the bundle of sticks metaphor for the various uses of property. But I was wondering if you could put a little bit more meat on those bones, in the sense of what's an example of a bundle of rights that you think is, in the near term, pretty tractable to blockchain resolution using some type of tokenized asset on that blockchain or tokenized representation on that blockchain, but also what's a bundle of rights that you think we're much further away from, just to kind of give our audience an idea of what's exciting now and what's a long ways off.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Eric, and it's something I've been particularly fascinated with too. So I think the area where we're seeing this play out first is with NFTs. So NFTs stand for non-fungible tokens. What that means is that you can create a token and know that it is the original or one of a handful of tokens related to a particular thing. And I'm using very general terms because it's designed technically in a very general way. So we've seen people take these NFT tokens and tie them to digital pieces of artwork, these non-fungible tokens. So an original author of a creative work, let's say a piece of digital art, can prove to the public that this is the master, this is the first print, the first edition, the first version of what they created. What we've seen is this simple ability to prove that you are the original owner of something has led to an explosion of interest. Just as an example, Christie's about 2 weeks ago auctioned their first NFT, and Christie's is obviously a very, very large auction house. They thought and listed it for $10,000. It sold for $133,000. And we're seeing large marketplaces like Super Rare, Async Art, and a handful of others that are beginning to show that if you can prove that this is an original, which is in part what property rights have. So it's akin to property rights, right? But property rights come from the state. I don't think anybody can claim that a blockchain provides property rights, but what it does do is define the metes and boundaries around these assets, who can own them, who can not own them, how many there are. All these basic parameters kind of creates a perimeter, a fence around these tokens. And the ability to define those metes and boundaries really, I think, is showing that there's some value to that in the digital realm. So what does that mean? I think people are beginning to think about how the NFT ecosystem and the use to people creating digital art and trading digital art may represent the first glimmers of the tokenization of intellectual property more broadly. So intellectual property, a big category, right? It's estimated that that it's worth about $5 trillion, right, of the US economy is just in IP rights. Well, that's a complete fiction of our imagination. We've created it, right? There's no such thing as intellectual property rights. We've invented it, right? Clever lawyers and scholars and other folks and government officials have created this property rights system around ideas and expressions of those ideas, and defined all these boundaries related to it. Well, that's completely fictitious. Well, we've also have these tokens, which are very abstracted away too. So they're merging together in a really interesting way. And I think you're going to see a lot of innovation around digital art, music, other creative works, where they're going to start defining these perimeters around different forms of intellectual property, and then creating marketplaces around them. So like one example here could be, which would be novel, if I'm an artist today, I can't sell you a specific song, right? Like I can't sell you the first stream of a song, but using this tech, you can define those boundaries around that. And maybe somebody is a huge, they wanted the first time that Imagine by the future version of like Imagine by the Beatles to be owned by them. You could see that having some form of value. So that's super interesting. And the mechanics related to how these things are bought, sold, and traded, I think to your second question, Eric, is going to increasingly define how other forms of property become digitized. So I think what we'll see next is the conversion of traditional artwork into the digital world, much like we saw the conversion of books that were written down in paper and converted into ebooks, in the 2000s and through today. I think we're going to start to see the same thing happen with traditional works, where an artist will basically take his or her rights, or an owner of a particular piece of artwork will take his or her or their rights and digitize that, represent that as a token, and then push it into this emerging commercial financialization infrastructure. And I think much like books, if a book isn't digitized at this point, it might as well be dead, right? It can't be found in Google. It can't be interacted with by the current generations of thinkers and scholars. If you have artwork that isn't digitized, I think it's just not going to exist at some point in the future, unless it's like, some crazy prominent work like the Mona Lisa that has like a huge vantage point, right? But much like you can't, you can digitize the Constitution, right? But you can't replace like kind of the original Constitution or something like that. But I think that these mechanics then and the digitization of art or other forms of IP will actually inform how other forms of property are digitized. And so there's been lots of conversations and use cases around things like fractionalized real estate, right? So what the heck does that look like? Well, I have a feeling that we're not just going to see NFTs digitized, but we're going to see the fractionalization of NFTs, right? The distribution of small shards of this NFT, which people can buy, sell, and trade. And maybe if we're comfortable with how that looks, and that doesn't offend regulators, and people have figured out business models around it, well, maybe I'm going to be a lot more comfortable taking my deed or other documentation that represents rights in a building or in a piece of property. Well, maybe I'm going to feel more comfortable digitizing that. And then maybe I feel more comfortable breaking the ownership of that into smaller pieces so that people can buy, sell, and trade it so we can get efficient pricing around that. So I think that some of these other kind of use cases, which lots of folks have talked about, it's not ready for prime time yet, in part because the mechanics haven't been laid out yet. And I think that digital art and NFTs may represent kind of the first non-virtual currency based asset and non kind of like utility token or protocol based asset, which really is an asset, right? It's like taking intellectual property and converting it into a blockchain based ecosystem for people to play around with. So that's where I think things may go there.
Excellent. So I haven't seen any questions in the chat or any raised hands among the participants. And so I'll use my moderator's privilege to ask another question, which you mentioned metes and bounds, or the metes and boundaries of various stores of value that we choose to recognize socially. It actually harkened to mind a very interesting law and economics piece that's very much historical, but don't worry, I will make it hopefully relevant, which was looking at the metes and bounds system of property demarcation in the eastern United States as compared to a rectangular system under the public land survey system that predominated once you got far enough west and the means of doing so changed under the law. The finding was one system, this very square, orderly, rectangular system, minimized transaction costs compared to the other system. And so now I'm hopefully making it relevant, which is we have an early emergent cryptocurrency, Bitcoin, that I'm sure everyone on this call has heard of, that uses one system for reaching consensus. Some people are like, this is great. This is, this provides a level of resilience to the network that cannot be paralleled through other means. The other system, or the other also salient competitor on, market capitalization charts, Ethereum, is working towards moving to a different system. And so some people are very optimistic and they're like, this is the new thing. This is the best. This is better. This is the QWERTY keyboard upgraded to the more efficient layout. And so what I welcome your thoughts on is, are you optimistic about proof of stake? Are you optimistic about innovation and consensus mechanisms generally? What does proof of work do well? What is it ill-suited to doing? And any kind of general thoughts in that realm?
Yeah, and I liked your this analogy, and I have read some of that work too, to how property rights in the U.S. have differed, and frankly, that kind of may run through the entire societies, right? Like because of the way that we establish property rights in Western parts of the country, there were things like the opportunities to set up public universities, which were much easier to do in the Western part of the country than the Eastern part, which had a much more fractured system. Here, I do think these tokens, they are standardization mechanisms, right? We are creating new standards around how they're created. And the nice thing is they're all composable. They all talk to one another. So those transaction costs, like you're referring to, they go down, right? When everything can talk to one another, everything is kind of lined up almost like squares. We begin to, or blocks, right? We begin to, I think, see a lot more efficient systems because the costs just go dramatically down. And the transactional cost analysis, at least in my work, is very important because I do think that's fundamentally what's happening. The cost of creating assets is going down, and that has big ramifications, just like we saw the cost of information go down over the past 20 years. So what happened, right? We saw an explosion of new content creators. I think we're going to see an explosion of people that are playing around with tokens or new forms of value systems. At the same time, we've seen information get broken down into smaller and smaller bits. So think about like Twitter is a good example here, or posts and on Facebook, et cetera. And then we've seen this massive aggregation layer that's being built on top. And I wouldn't be surprised if that's what happened with value, right? Things that were not possible before because it was too expensive now will become possible, like fractionalization or sharding or breaking things down to small bits. Combining those small bits into new sets, right? And hedging them in different ways may become possible because it's easy to re-aggregate it. And at the same time, I think you're going to see at some point in the top, I don't know when that hits, like some aggregator layer that's going to become pretty powerful. But I think, and this is what makes blockchain so interesting, all these property rights are enforced by consensus, right? And this is your second question, or the actual question. The first part was just my commentary. But the actual question relating to consensus mechanisms, they matter, right? They have certain characteristics that I think that bleed all the way through the system. And I've written about, or we've written about this in Blockchain Law, but blockchains are fundamentally political systems in the sense that they kind of embody these sets of rules. Politics and politique still kind of exists in them. On the Bitcoin network, the consensus is really slow. It's very rigid. There's a not just at the code level, but also at the kind of social norm level around Bitcoin, a huge impetus to not actually change anything in the system. And that may work really well for Bitcoin, right? If your aim and your goal collectively as a group is to build a very, very rigid store of value that everybody can trust, well, that makes a lot of sense that you don't want to change much about that, right? Like you want to keep that like the dinosaur, right? Keep it slow and steady, very careful changes. Anything you do to disrupt that's going to be problematic. Now there's some trade-offs with that, right? It may not be as fast, right? You may not be able to get the latest, greatest thing, but at least you know that this core value, this core asset that you're trying to have a blockchain-based network maintain will not go down in value. I think with Ethereum and other blockchains have already experimented in this direction. They are unwilling to make that trade-off. In part, I think Ethereum is still figuring out what it wants to be. But in many ways, I kind of view Ethereum like the investment bank. You see a lot of what's emerging on top of it as not being core stores of value, although it does store, Ether itself could be viewed as a store of value. It's really building all the applications and services on top of that. One notable example here would be this flywheel that's emerging between Bitcoin and Ethereum, where over I think it's at like about $2 billion worth of Bitcoin is now being fed into all of these DeFi projects. And it's grown significantly over the past couple of years. So you're seeing kind of like one digital asset interacting, like this gold reserve kind of interacting with these more investment banking like functionalities of Ethereum. And so they're moving to proof of stake, which is just a faster or arguably more, sorry, just started a comment, arguably more efficient system, right? You should be able to propagate information to a blockchain faster instead of it taking 12 seconds like it does today on Ethereum. Maybe it'll take a fraction of a second. You'll be able to get higher throughput and you'll have more transactional volume. So I think it's good that there's experimentation there. I know enough in the technology realm and have developed it, but I am not a distributed systems specialist. And so I do think that there's open questions about that. But assuming that the folks that are experts in this are comfortable with it, I think that's a great thing that we're experimenting with proof of stake. And we've seen other blockchains which are not as popular and probably in 20 years will be footnotes, things like Tezos and other platforms, which have a fair amount of value that's being transacted across them that are using these proof of stake like systems, and they seem to be working okay. So if that's the case, then I don't know why we wouldn't want to kind of move beyond that. I think there's other interesting things about blockchains, which is maybe not changing the core consensus engine, which is like a very, very deep in the stack change, but instead layering things on top. So there's always been a debate in the blockchain ecosystem whether or not a blockchain will serve as kind of like the spine with all these subchains coming off of it. And it seems like that's kind of mushing into practice, but the things pulling off of the spine or the bones sitting off of the spine itself, they look like they may be things like zero knowledge proofs in the short term, or these ZK rollups. So it's like a different way to basically get some of the faster speed, but actually prove that everything is correct. So that may be a direction where we go.
Awesome. So Martin actually has a question up next.
Yeah. So first of all, great talk, Aaron. It's very stimulating. Thanks. I guess I had a thought that I was going to add, but it's escaped my brain for the moment. Maybe I'll get back to it. So I was very interested in the regulatory transformation. I mean, you were talking about regulator as code, and that you require bits of code to be either inserted or interface.
Yeah,
that's actually fascinating. It's a very interesting concept, and it sort of stands in contrast to regulation. I mean, or the way regulation is done. A couple of things, and again, this is more commentary than anything else, that regulators are not very well situated to do this kind of work right now. The auditability of the kind of code that regulators might add is also not very well suited. I mean, it's not as open. I mean, I think about the Administrative Procedures Act, for instance, which has this whole public comment period, and it's written in plain English, and so you can sort of see what the regulation is trying to do, what it's going to do. You can look at other people's comments. It's a transparent process for humans. Code would not be nearly as transparent for the majority of humans. The other thing about that is that regulation, at least in part, is about making political trade-offs, and these political trade-offs change over time. I mean, I guess even if we just look back over the last, let's say 8 years or 12 years in our own history, and we look at sort of the changes in regulatory posture that have taken place and the different kinds of political trade-offs that were made, it's really kind of remarkable. And I guess the question then becomes, how could you do regulatory transformation in that space? And especially if you want to avoid this problem that I think we all face of layering regulation upon regulation, because it would be easier just to add new bits of code rather than to rewrite bits of code that would have to take place. So again, I mean, this is a whole melange of stuff that I've thrown at you. I apologize for that.
No, but it's good. These are great questions. And I maybe I can just react to the comments and questions. Number one, yeah, governments are definitely not ready for it now. But almost to what we were chatting about even before the talk, at some point, people need to take risks, and governments are no exceptions. Governments used to rule without paper records. If we go back in time far enough, right? They didn't have the competency to actually write things down and all the record keeping functions that were necessary for it. I'm sure in a country like the United States with so many brilliant people and probably the largest base of software developers and folks that work with information systems can marshal enough will around it if they find it to be beneficial. You're right, maybe an APA-like process may not be the right approach here, but statutes do not necessarily go through an entire APA process in all instances, right? That's more regulatory agencies. So there's the ability, I think, to set forth a framework to do that if there's a desire to do it. And I think that there's some benefits to it. And then I think the second points that you were alluding to are kind of more architectural decisions. Like, should the code that gets deployed be an actual smart contract that's hard to change, or should it instead just be like a pipe, like an API that could be interacted with? And I think that there's probably advantages and disadvantages to both. But we're seeing with Oracle solutions, and this is why I think it's a core part of the stack, they are able to take outside data feeds and bring them on chain. So you can imagine, let's say, an API that needed to be interacted with, ported and authenticated from a government source, some form of government authentication, and then brought onto these systems. And then the system itself can prove that it's in compliance, right? That prove that it interacted with it. And that, I think, is pretty powerful. That means, and let me just use an example here, like a tax example. So we put together, through a project that I do a lot of work on called Open Law, an example where we took an employee offer letter. So it looked like a standard employee offer letter that we had today, but under the hood, we connected it to a smart contract that paid people in real time. So every 12 seconds, your bank account would go up in value. So we thought that that was interesting because there's a massive payday loan marketplace where people pay usurious rates. It's pretty bad. And because you can move assets so freely on a blockchain, wouldn't it be great if we all got paid in real time? You could literally watch your bank account tick up every 12 seconds or every minute or something like that. At the same time, we implemented the federal tax code in a smart contract and some of the tools we had on the open law side to do some light computations to keep the cost down. And we're able to show how the government could collect taxes in real time. So imagine if you're a business, you could basically prove that you're in compliance with payroll taxes just by plugging in that smart contract, right? You'd have an auditable record of it. You wouldn't have to worry that you didn't or did not pay your taxes. You could just move on with your day. And sure, some accountants may cry, and sure, some businesses may not may not be in existence like ADP, or maybe some of the newer glosses on the same business, but everybody would be better off, right? The government would know that it had people that were paying. It would be able to collect that revenue much faster. Businesses would not have to worry about as many compliance-related questions. That seems like a win all the way around to me. And I do think governments are not as agile as they need to be for this informational age. And the only way that they're going to get to that point is by taking this information head on. These bureaucratic systems may not be efficient enough, and we need to think about areas where we can move quicker, so we're not wasting our time on these things that can be solved technically, and instead we're focusing on bigger issues that demand our attention. I personally think this code as law idea is also going to become increasingly important, not just with blockchains, but other forms of automated systems. So if we're concerned about things like how do we cabin in rogue artificial intelligence, and that may sound like an edge case now, but I'm not convinced that it will be in 20 years. Well, maybe you need these types of systems and checkpoints that the government or the people put in place to make sure that things don't go sideways and we don't all live in like a 1990s action movie, which I love so much growing up, right? So, or late 1980s. So I think we can do it. It just takes some effort, some leadership, and I feel like the U.S. is in the best position by far to do that. And I do think if we took this approach first, we would make sure that other jurisdictions that may not take the right approach here, don't build this infrastructure first. Code scales globally, right? So there's a lot of advantages to it.
So driving directly on that point about the regulatory stance, especially within the United States, and what we might be able to do to either foment or hinder innovation in these areas, you made a really interesting statement that I'm kind of hopeful you can expand on a little bit more. And it surrounds liability for, and you use the term controlling members in your talk, but I mean, imagine even I could envision a regulatory construction involving staked validators whose capital is sufficiently tied up in a blockchain network to be construed as something the equivalent of like a founding shareholder in a fledgling startup. And so I'm kind of just wondering if you could expand a bit more about limited liability, individual liability for potentially controlling members, and how that can actually potentially stymie both development, but governance. As you noted, the governance incentives for network members might be readily implicated by the regulatory stance chosen.
Yeah, 1000%. And I think we're see a looming battle around whether tradable governance rights are going to be considered a security, and how that's going to be viewed. If they're viewed as a security, it just means a smaller number of people can participate in governance. And if you believe in participatory systems, that just eliminates that off the bat. And I'm hoping, and I feel like there may be some appetite from regulators to kind of let just governance rights trade. And it sounds like you're deep in law and economics. There's a lot of law and economics talking about governance rights. So if we view contracts as kind of gap fillers, and to fill in certain issues that can't be provided by, like, let's say, off-the-shelf contracts or off-the-shelf legal regimes, things like a legal entity, or the default rules that are set in a statute for a legal entity. Well, those contracts actually fill the gap, right? Governance fills the gap. And I think what's the most interesting thing about what we're seeing with these new emergent networks, they've kind of standardized everything. You kind of take them on a take it or leave it basis, almost like a extreme version of a click wrap agreement. And so if I'm a consumer or somebody that needs to interact with these click wrap agreements, how am I going to know which system is the same? Let's assume that it's pretty commoditized, right? It's all free and open source software, so it's easy to fork. I'm going to see competing examples of services that do the same thing. Well, maybe if there's a token and that token trades for a fairly high value, that's an easy and rough proxy for me to estimate that this is a well-governed system, right? Maybe I'm more likely to deploy my assets into this system if I know that a lot of other people are excited about it. And maybe I'm not technical, right? Maybe I'm not sophisticated, but it's easy enough for me to kind of look at the price of something, look at market forces to kind of assess, whether or not governance is being done well here. With the presumption that if it's trading for high value or significantly higher value than something else, well, that means it's probably a better system, more stable system, more trustworthy system, et cetera. And I think that plays out with corporations, right? If you look at which stocks are trading at the highest value, they tend to be very well-run companies, right? They're very profitable. They're run by responsible people, et cetera. And if you go down to the penny stocks, you don't have the same feeling necessarily. So I think that there is a market-based dynamic for governance that we now have the ability to explore that is incredibly important. And I think that, to your point, and I agree with it completely, that the way regulators approach this will really shape it. If we decide that we're not going to let people trade their governance rights, we're going to instead treat that as a security, then we're not going to see this full participatory system emerge. And what's really interesting about governance rights, we're not just seeing people create tradable tokens for governance, we're also seeing proxy systems develop, hyper-efficient proxy systems. We're seeing new ways to kind of assemble and deal with information related to incentivizing people to participate. There's an interesting project called Power Pool that's playing around with this, where you can basically like buy the rights and lever them up and do lots of interesting financialization related to governance rights. We couldn't do that before, right? And we couldn't do that before because it was really hard to untether in a traditional security governance rights from economic rights. And since we're dealing with kind of a new species here, things that are not necessarily corporations, where there's no express economic rights, I'm not also fully convinced that all the value won't just go to the governance rights holders themselves. So I hope we figure this out, and I hope it's done right. But I definitely feel like the government's going to have to get comfortable with it. I don't know if they're there yet. I'm hoping in part that we'll have a higher risk appetite post-COVID, just to make up for some of the cost of COVID. And maybe we'll see at least some experimentation here that's accepted. That may depend on the regulatory regime in charge, the level of risk that we're willing to take in this arena.
Yeah, that's right. And I think we've actually seen some interesting recent moves. I'm most sanguine about the OCC and saying, look, we've got to expand this charter to include fintech. Although we could probably have a full session devoted to banking regulation in the United States. But we have an interesting question in the chat. Mookie, do you want to answer it or ask it yourself, or do you want me to paraphrase?
No, I can ask it. I was just thinking about your kind of Cardozo Law and thinking about kind of plugging in a tax as like an API that you can plug into with your business. But how is that going to change maybe kind of lawmaking and practice, because they have to come up with more specific like actual bits of code that they're going to write, and I feel like that might lead to fierce competition among interest groups and anyone who's interested in affecting how that law. So and how will that play out in the courts, and where can people get remedy for that? I'm just interested in any ideas around that.
Yeah, it's a great question, Mickey. And I think you also, when you described it in writing, you also mentioned, right, parts of the law, they purposely have baked in wiggle room, right? And that's unique to kind of the US, UK common law system, where folks recognize that actually the most efficient solution is not being hyper precise. It's actually keeping it open-ended and flexible. It acts more like cartilage in your body as opposed to like some sort of rigid piece. And that means that if there's an issue, like the court has to weigh in, they're able to gain some flexibility to make sure that there's not results that folks would consider unfair or unjust or absurd in different ways. So I don't think Cardozo Law works for those parts of the law. So if there's a more standards-based approach, like use your best efforts, or you need to be reasonable, you're not going to be able to necessarily pop that into a smart contract. But there's plenty parts of the law that are fairly objective, right? Like a car can only have X amount of emissions, right, per its weight. Or the tax code, or in the financial context, there's lots of requirements around how much capital you have to have, et cetera. So I think the code as law pieces work really well in those contexts. The same thing if you're concerned about dealing with peoples from certain countries, maybe a protocol checks an IP address, right, and also checks a list of countries or persons that are not able to engage in these systems. Those are two things that are pretty objective to identify. So I think that may be where it goes. In terms of enforcement, right? If it's a law, like if the actual government implements it, then it would have to have the same legal weight and effect as other statutes, right? And so courts, unless they're unconstitutional, are obligated at the federal level and also at the state level, right, to enforce the laws if they're statutorily implemented. So I think that's how it play out. If there, I think you're right. In any legislative drafting process, just like code-based drafting process, it would be political in nature. But I think we're somewhat familiar with that. For standards bodies, it's pretty much the same thing, right? We've seen this in the blockchain space. You see big behemoth tech giants kind of swarm around standards organizations, hoping to like just tilt those standards a little bit closer to how they do it than the other side, right? They want the plug to be the one that they make, not the one that their competitor makes, etc. So, so I don't think you get rid of that in the system, but it's kind of the same political setup, and whatever kind of comes out of the sausage making process, that would have legal effect and otherwise.
Yeah, it kind of makes sense for them to start at least with industries or with laws that are really suited for Cardozo Law first, and seeing how kind of the ecosystem develops around that. Kind of as a follow-up, you mentioned like other countries as blocking IP addresses and stuff, but I'm also interested in jurisdictional issues about with regarding Cardozo Law, or even like with remittances being used on blockchains or blockchains that try to get around kind of international law. I'm wondering if you see more kind of international coordination happening because of just by necessity of having to deal with this kind of unregulatable technology.
Well, I think what's the most interesting thing about blockchains, we analogize this in our book. So in the international context, there was a set of law called Lex Mercatoria, which was merchant's law. It's really the foundation for most commercial law today. So since traders, particularly in Europe, were traveling on the seas, they would have disputes. Instead of turning to a court of a king or some other ruler, they created their own courts. They created their own rules. And it kind of filled the gaps, like the international gaps that they were grappling with, that a particular jurisdiction can handle. My sense is a blockchain is that gap filler for the globe, right? It sits actually above any jurisdiction, and it actually has a lot of characteristics that are often also underappreciated. Things like dispute resolution, you can actually do in really interesting ways with a blockchain, and we've done some experiments here because you actually get power to enforce a judgment. So a court is really important because not only does it provide justice, but it also can settle the judgment. It can mandate that somebody pay and another party receive compensation for damages. You could do the same thing with a blockchain, with a smart contract, right? An arbitrator, a human can sit, or a group of humans can sit, weigh in, and a smart contract can pull the money from one account and direct it to another account. So really, for the first time in history, we've taken some power away from courts. So in this technology embedded, I don't think it's fully materialized yet, but not only have we taken power from central banks, but we've also taken power from the judicial system as well, conceivably or theoretically. And I think that that's really important when you start thinking about international systems, right? Not only do you have an international standard for things like remittances when it comes to payment, which is really important. I think the only thing that's capping that is the speed with which you can process transactions, right? It's not as powerful as Visa or MasterCard or Western Union, in part because it just can't process the same volume. And then I think also the other issue with remittances is this quote last mile problem, right? Like, how do you actually get in the hands of enough people to kind of build that network? Like, how do you get somebody that's in a rural part of India to like be able to interact with digital assets in some sort of way? And that's why, and there's lots of questions around things like Libra, but the idea that billions of people could have a wallet, which would instantaneously link them together, is pretty exciting. I think it's kind of like the AOL moment for things. So I definitely think remittances are coming. I think the big question is it something like Libra? Is it something like a central bank digital currency, or is it something kind of native to these blockchain ecosystems that will fill that area? But ultimately, I do think public blockchains will kind of fill in this international gap because it just has some unique characteristics that no one government can provide. Universal availability, the ability to build like rudimentary dispute resolution provisions, the ability to build systems that kind of transcend national borders, et cetera. Yeah, and that's a great point, Mookie, in the chat, right? Last mile problems, governments could encourage that, right? We've seen, not in the blockchain context, but in areas like Kenya, where M-Pesa came out, right? The government was supported by a government-backed telecom company, right? So they can incentivize and solve these problems if they want to. I just think it's the early days, right? Like there's only presumably, I think 1 million active users on popular wallet platforms like MetaMask. That's a really small number of people. That's a lot for a financial services company. That's like a 1 million effective like weird bank accounts that have been set up. That's pretty darn good. But it's still not like what we saw with the internet, where everybody has an email address, right? Everybody has some way to interact with it, and they've learned all the mechanics of what to do. Like they're used to like clicking a button on a website. So it was so natural to me because I grew up with the internet. I'm right age for that. But for older generations, they had to like learn how to search, learn how to do email. Like it was much harder for them to do that. And there's all these user mechanics that I don't think people are familiar with yet. Like sticking your phone up and reading a QR code to transfer something. Like that may be easy for you, Mookie, right? But it may not be as easy for your grandparents or your parents or some of the older folks in your family. I think we'll get there. Yeah, I think it's gonna be cool.
So speaking of blockchain potentially shifting the locus of enforcement authority or removing the need for enforcement in certain contexts entirely, I'm less concerned, although still concerned about courts jealously guarding their authority, but they seem to have less affirmative action power than agencies. And so you've several times today made the interesting point that you think eventually everything or all blockchains, especially ones that of significance, of structural economic significance, will be public. And so I'm wondering, do you see a path to public blockchain supported central bank digital currencies? And if you could sketch out a little bit what that looks like, because I see that as being somewhat threatening to our current model of fiscal policy in the United States. And so I hope we get there, but I'm also very much wondering how we get there.
Yeah, so I had, in part because I got into this so early, I proposed back to the Fed and a bunch of researchers there back in like 2014 or 15, pretty much like people didn't call it that at the time, but like a permission blockchain for central bank digital currencies. They came to a group of researchers and said, if we hypothetically wanted to digitize the dollar, what would that look like? What we said is, look, you can start with a permission blockchain. It can be, pan jurisdiction, so it's not just for the US dollar, but for a whole bunch of other currencies. So you get that interoperability, right? You get things like we see on Ripple, et cetera. And then you can scale it, right? These things are not scalable yet. Blockchains are not scalable yet. They're kind of like 1950s mainframe computers, or in all more reality, more like 1990s cell phones, like when you're playing Snake on or something like that, in terms of their compute power. Yeah, it was a great game. Played a lot of Snake. But over time, I think we've seen with computing that people are clever, they solve problems, and they'll be able to scale more and more. Maybe it's the staking consensus level solutions. Maybe there's some crazy thing where we can move information faster than the speed of light, and that can speed things up, right? There's a whole host of different ways that they can be made more efficient. I think in the long run that we will see central bank digital currencies running on public blockchains, just like we see other forms of government services operating on the World Wide Web today. This just is a core function. And I do think that there's a huge incentive now for the US to take the lead here, especially when you see countries like China that are pushing on central bank digital currencies of their own. I also think your point about it creating a systemic risk is reasonable. I don't think we're there, but even researchers in the 90s that were thinking about e-currencies, they always kind of foresaw an issue with e-currency becoming so widely used that it leads to a decrease in deposits at central banks, which would prevent some of the monetary policy that central bankers provide. So assuming that you think that that's a those are good policies. You could imagine that folks would want to do that. But maybe, even in that scenario, right? And maybe Bitcoin or Ether or some of these other digital assets are not being used as the primary means of payment. It still doesn't eviscerate all these other things, right? Like a central bank's not going to create assets for intellectual property, right? It's not necessarily going to mint or create a digital gold. So I think these systems will serve as kind of a competitive lever with some of these central banks. And I think that that's probably healthy in the long run, like if we can create some form of competition. Same thing with courts, right? Courts may decide that they will not give up some power over things, but frankly, they already have. So in the US, we had something called the Federal Arbitration Act, which gives people broad latitude to resolve their disputes privately. The US is very unique in this regard. Well, not with arbitration, but just in general, we just have strong notions of private contracting and ordering that really have influenced the way the world looks at this. But if parties agree that they want something to be arbitrated online using a blockchain-based system, if it's appropriately documented, papered up, there's not much a court can do. We can actually build internet courts if we wanted to. Internet courts that have teeth, right? Not just people making decisions, but can actually move value. There's an interesting glimmers of this in a project called Aragon Court, although it deferred when there was a problem back to a local court. But there's the beginning bits of this kind of emerging. So maybe this is kind of like the sea land of the internet, just like the beginning of certain things. All right. So my wife came in. I would love to stay forever. I can talk about this forever.
No, thanks so much for staying over.
Yeah, and if you guys have any questions or want to chat about anything else, I'm always happy to do that. Thank you so much for inviting me. I was honored to be with the great list of speakers and thinkers and writers that you've included. I think it's tremendous that you've been able to do this, and it's really been my honor to participate. So thank you very much.
Thank you. This is great.
Eric, and yeah, awesome. All right, guys, I hope you have a wonderful weekend.
Yep. See you later.
All right, bye, guys.